Okay, this is lesson 10 of our Revelation Part 2 study discussion, and we are moving right along with only 2 more lessons after this in this part. Obviously, we've got parts 3 and parts 4 to do, which might not be obvious, but now that I've just said it, now it's obvious. We will, last week as we were discussing, we were beginning to be able to do kind of some timeline and be able to put a view of the time phrases on our timeline. We didn't complete all the information on our bowls, and we don't want to not do that, so we'll try to get that in a little bit today as well. But mainly, this week, we focused on chapters 17 and chapter 18. So what was the main subject matter of this week? Babylon, right. So, as we're going to do, we're going to jump in, but we're going to kind of review at the same time. There is something that's going on starting in chapter 17 with John. What is that? He's in the Spirit again. So this is his, how many times? This is his third of 4 in the Spirit times. And the first is in chapter 1. The second one is in chapter 4. Now the third one is in chapter 17. And if you consider that everything that happens in the Spirit from one time to the next is within that experience, then everything from chapter 1 all the way through chapters 2 and 3 is the first experience. Now that would, chapter 1 is also in what segment division that John is given in chapter 1. It's in the first segment division that's called the things he had seen, right? And that is covered by chapter 1. Chapters 2 and 3 cover the second segment division, which is when John was told to write what? The things which are. And then from chapters 4 to 22 is the third segment division, which is the things that will happen after these things. And that is what we're in, obviously, in chapter 17. But then when you start looking at the book in terms of John's in the Spirit experiences, you have a different set of segment divisions. So we've already been through the first one with John, from John chapter 1 to 2 and 3. That actually we covered in Revelation part 1. So in chapter 4, when he's taken in the Spirit, in chapter 1 he sees what he sees on earth, right? But in chapter 4 in the Spirit, where is he taken? He's taken to heaven, right? So everything he sees from the perspective of heaven, but that doesn't mean everything that happens that he sees happens there, right? So he sees it maybe starting, or he sees what's going on there, almost like the behind the scenes. It's almost like you're watching a play to a certain extent, and you don't see what's happening in the eaves or maybe even in the orchestra pit. You just see what's happening on the stage. To a certain extent, that's how we view life, right? And we're told in Ephesians chapter 6 that there's a whole realm of other things going on even while we sit here. There's warfare going on in places that we don't see in the heavenlies, for instance. In a sense, that's the kind of thing that we're seeing here. John is getting both perspectives. We're getting both perspectives as he gives it to us. But when we live our life, we only see the one part. We see what's going on the stage, in essence. We don't hear the prompters off the stage. So we are seeing it that way. And God's giving us through John the bigger picture. And one of the things we found is who is bringing all of this about. Jesus, right? In exactly what way? How are all these events coming about?
He's breaking the seals.
It's breaking the seals. Breaking the seals that were on the book or scroll, as it would be better, that was in the right hand of he who sat on the throne, and Jesus the Lamb came up, took that book, and it had 7 seals, and he begins breaking those seals. Now why, if we are in chapter 17 or wherever we are, do we still say, as Jesus breaks the seals, these events occur? Because we're past the seals, right? They're all covered in what chapters?
6.
Most of them are in 6. 6 of them are in 6. And then the next one, the 7th seal happens was in chapter 8. But what happens in that 7th seal? The trumpets are given to the 7 angels, right? Mm-hmm. So essentially the 7 trumpets are the 7th seal, right? And so then as the trumpets play out, and these are successive events, as the trumpets play out at the 7th trumpet, what happens? The 7 angels are given the 7 bowls. So all 7 bowls are part of the 7th trumpet. So basically you collapse the bowls, you put them into the 7th trumpet, you collapse the trumpets, and you put them in the 7th seal. So really, everything is contained in the 7 seals, in essence, even though we want to make sure we play them out. But as we begin to try to put events in time, which we can't always know, we can know some things, and we get clues from Scripture. That's what we're trying to dig into and see. So where we are is, at this point in time, we have had in chapter 16, all 7 bowls poured out. And what is true that happens, what are we told happens when all 7 bowls are poured out? What is in those bowls? The wrath of God. Therefore, in the pouring out of all of them, the wrath of God is finished, right, or complete. So we could say, okay, we're done. Well, we're not done. There's more to the story. There's more that's going to happen. But we do know in the 7th, the pouring out of all, the end of the 7th bowl, the wrath of God is finished. Just a little bit of, as we did our timeline last week, and I'll put it back up there in a minute, but I just want to remind, as we looked at the 7 seals, and then coming out of the 7 seals are the 7 trumpets, and then out of the 7th trumpet, the 7 bowls, we were able to put on the timeline the ending of something. We saw in chapter 11, remember 1 and 1, what do we see in chapter 11? The 2 witnesses, right. And they're given how long for their prophecy? 1260 days. We know that to also be 42 months, 3.5 years, but that's the time frame they're given is 1260 days. We see in chapter 11 the end of that 1260 days, ended with their prophecy ending. What brought about the end of their prophesying? Death by who? The beast that came out of the abyss. Okay, and that's something to hang on to because we're going to see that again, that phrase again. So that the ending of their prophesying happened at the ending of the 6th trumpet. Got to remember which one. And so at the ending of the 6th trumpet, if you go backwards from there, you have 1260 days. Okay? Also, then we go in chapter 12, and it talks about the 2 signs, which is the woman and the dragon. But we also see events, and we had to kind of understand who is the woman and who is the dragon. But towards the end of that, we see, middle of it, we see an event, which is called the war in heaven. Who is the war in heaven? What are the sides of the war in heaven? Okay, we got dragon, we know is Satan, because we're told that, and his angels, against Michael and his angels. So we have Michael and his angels. Michael, we're not necessarily told who that is, but through Scripture, we understand Michael to be an archangel. The one that guards Israel, if you look at Daniel. That's just a little piece of information. But Michael and his angels, and it appears the way it said is the dragon is his angels make war with, but there is a war in heaven. As a result of that war, what happens? Satan is cast out of heaven and down to earth, very definitely down to earth. And who goes with him? His angels, right? So Satan and his angels are cast down to earth, and so there's a moment in time that happens, and as a result from that point forward, what is his focus?
Destroying, keeping people from
right.
Whatever he can.
Yeah, doing the worst he can because he knows he only has a short time. So he's enraged, but he specifically goes after what? The woman, which we've identified as Israel. Right. So he goes after the woman. She's kind of protected. He does some things. And well, she's not kind of protected. She's very much protected. But the earth actually swallows up the river that comes out of his mouth in that very specific way. But she is sent into, or flees into the wilderness for what period of time? Times and half a time. And there's another time phrase that's also given in chapter 12 for that same period of time. One was 1260 days. But it also says times and half a time, which we know is, so we know times and half time is 3.5 years. We can call that 3.5 years or 42 months. Those are other phrases that we might use for that same period of time, amount of time. And so when dragon goes off after the woman for that period of time, and she goes into the wilderness and is nourished and protected during that time, and the earth helps her, he gets enraged and he goes off after who? The rest of her offspring who keep the testimony of Jesus. Okay? So you've got the woman Israel, and you've got the rest of her offspring, that when he can't touch the woman, when God protects her, he goes off the rest of her offspring. Okay, and then you see in chapter 13 that he's standing on the seashore and he watches the beast come out of the waters, right? So we have one beast, we have a two beast in chapter 13, but there's a time going on here, because when he's cast to earth and he only has a short period of time, then there's this 1260 days that the woman is nourished. Is that, which period of time is that? So we're trying to establish that. But we see in chapter 13 this beast coming on the scene and given power by who? The dragon. And he wants this beast to do specific things. So he empowers that beast, gives him authority and gives him a kingdom. Okay? During that time, the beast tries to war against the saints and tries to overcome them. He's given that by the devil to do, or Satan to do. And there's an image erected by the earth dwellers, because the second beast tells them to do that. That image is to be worshipped, and it's the image of the first beast. The image can speak. There's signs and wonders that are going on, and there's a mark of the beast. And then you go forward. As we see when does that happen? We began to see that when the woman is going to be nourished for time and half a time, or 1260 days, is when the dragon comes down to earth and is thrown to earth, and he is enraged and only has a short time. And we saw that, we believe that's going forward in this direction, because of the timing of when the dragon comes down to earth and when the beast is in power, and what happens as a result of that. Now, if the beast in chapter 13, if his big power starts at that point and moves forward during this time of the woman being nourished, is he on the scene back here? He's on the scene. He exists back before that point in time. I mean, he's not going to just appear on earth and be given authority. If he's a human, he's going to have been alive, and some things are going to happen. So keep that in mind. It's easy to think that, boom, he just comes on the scene and he flashes forward and does all this stuff. But we're going to see some of that in our chapter 17 and 18. I just wanted to get that as your thought process as we're trying to put things in time. Okay, so in chapter 17, which is after 16, and in chapter 16, you have the 7 bowls being poured out, all 7 bowls. Okay, remember chapter 6 is 6 bowls, chapter 16 is 6 is 6 seals, and chapter 16 is 7 of the bowls, and 1 and 6 make up 7, add up together to make up 7. So I'm trying to give you ways to remember things. It helps me to try to help remember things. Okay, so in 17, after the events of the bowls have been poured out, but let's back up just a little bit, sorry, I'm turning my page back. In the 7th bowl, one of the things that is said is what? Right at the end. I'm sorry?
It is done.
It is done, because we know that the wrath of God is finished within those bowls. So it says it is done. It also, it says, a loud voice came out of the temple saying, it is done. There's flashes of lightning, sounds of peals of thunder, a great earthquake. The city, the great city, was split in 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Then it says, Babylon the Great, this is verse 19. What does it say? Was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. Okay? So then when you transition into chapter 17 and you're introduced to Babylon, and in chapter 18 you see what big event happening in chapter 18? The fall of Babylon. It's told to us in the 7th bowl. Right? Now Babylon is being remembered. Now she's being given the cup of the wrath of God. Is that what was described in chapter 18? So it's like the bowls are poured out, it's finished, but now he's going to stop and tell us about that specific event. So where does the fall of Babylon happen in time? In our timeline time.
After the 1260.
After what?
The 1260.
Oh, after the 1260, I was like, chapter 12, where are you
No.
going? Yeah,
Days,
I
after the
understand.
12:16.
Okay, yeah, but specifically in one of the seals, trumpets, or bowls, where do we find it? The seventh bowl. Okay, so sorry, you were being very specific, which is good. I was being a little more general. Okay, and we'll put that up there, you know, if you can kind of see the hint of my line before, you've got the seventh bowl here, so this is where you would see the fall of Babylon. You see, there's other things, like it is done, is said, and she's remembered for the wine of her fierce wrath, to take the cup of the wine of God's fierce wrath. And then there's also islands fled away, mountains are not found, and the 100-pound hailstones fall on men, and men blaspheme God. But here she's remembered, and then in 18 we see, what does that mean? What does that look like? Similarly, in Scripture we see in the creation account, in the sixth day of creation, it says man and then man as in mankind, and then it says woman and man as in gender were created on that sixth day in the image of God. And then in chapter 2, it's not a separate event, it's telling us about that event. How did it come about? How did God do it? Similar to that here. We have the event name, and then we have information to tell us how the event, what the event looks like. All right? So, but we have this, yes, Donna.
It says that Babylon has this other, like
Name or
name on her forehead.
right?
Why is that? Because you would think she would have the 666.
Ah, well, that's interesting because if you'll just hang on, I think we might be able to answer that within, rather than me just giving you an answer. Okay, it's an interesting thought. Okay, so we're going to talk about Babylon. We're going to see what we can see. We're going to understand that prophecy needs to be interpreted how? First. Literally, if we can. Figuratively, if it tells us it needs to be figurative. Or figurative if it can't be literal. I guess that's another way of putting it. But sometimes there's words, like, for instance, that tell us whether, not like is the way we use that slang now, but using the word as a comparative word. In chapter 17, we've got John being taken in the Spirit where?
Wilderness.
Into the wilderness. He changes locations again. All right? So this is significant because he's going to see something else. He's going to see something different. And so we're going to look at that time in the Spirit. So what does he see? We're going to talk about not just, we'll put this up in a minute, but we're going to talk about Babylon. But we also want to look at some things about the beast, because he obviously is part of this. What can we understand about them? How do they relate? How does it relate to some of the other personages that we looked at this week? So if you have your list and have your charts and all that stuff, I've got a whole bunch of papers here to consider. But mainly stick to the text of 17. But if you made your list, it'll be helpful. So as we look, she is called first what? She's not identified as Babylon at first. What is she identified as? A woman. Okay, and what else? Right, the great harlot, right? What is the description? What does she look like? Just give me some of the facts as they come up. Okay, she's clothed in purple and scarlet. And then she's adorned, right?
Oh, precious stones and pearls.
Is there gold in there somewhere?
Yes.
Okay. But back up just a little bit in the very first description. What is she sitting on first? What are you told she's sitting on?
Scarlet beast.
Well, first she
she's
sits
sitting
on,
the 7 hills.
first she's sitting on, first she's sitting on many waters. Thank you. Yes, all of these are true. She sits on, and we'll just put many waters. And then we see that she's riding on the beast. And then you also said, what is it? Is it the 7 kings or 7 mountains?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, and there, she's standing on or sitting on those, but she's on these things. I have to go down and look. You know, it says on which she sits. Okay, so these are throughout that chapter. She's sitting on many waters. That's the first time we see her. She's riding on the beast, so that's the same idea as sitting on or standing on the beast. And then it also says she's sitting on these 7 kings, which are also the 7 heads. That's the description we're given of those 7 heads of the, which one, of who? Who these 7 heads belong to? The beast. Okay, so then we see how she's clothed. What else do we see about her?
She's holding a gold cup in her hand.
Okay, she's got a gold cup. Does it tell us what that cup is or why?
Full of abominations and unclean things.
Okay. The abominations and unclean things of her,
Immorality.
okay, I thought it had that, okay. Because immorality is huge in the description of her. What else do we hear about immorality where she's concerned? She commits. She commits immorality with what 2 groups is that identified with?
Drop of the blood of the saints.
Kings and what else? And those who dwell on the earth, right? So I'm gonna say EDs. Yes. They participate in her immorality. Kings and those who dwell on the earth. So immorality is a huge part of this. And then you see the beast. What are we told about the beast? There's more to the woman. Yeah, there's more to the woman, but what do we, in that one verse, when you're talking about she's riding on the beast, what do we are told about the beast?
Full of splendor.
He's scarlet, and he's full of blasphemous names, right?
Yes.
And has 7 heads and 10 horns.
7 heads and 10 horns.
And 10 crowns on his horns.
Okay, I'm gonna put this, did it say crowns?
Yes.
Okay, because sometimes it'll say diadems, I can't remember. Okay, and so I'm just putting on, off the horns, there's crowns on the horns. Okay.
On each head, blasphemous name.
Okay, so on the heads, we've got blasphemous names. Okay, and then what else? So then we see that she's clothed in part. If we're just literally going through the verses, in verse 5, this is where it says, on her forehead a name was written. And this name is a mystery, it says. What is that name? Okay, so it says Babylon the Great. It also says she's what?
The mother of prostitutes.
Yeah, the mother of harlots. So she's not just a harlot, she's the mother of harlots. And of what?
Abominations.
And abominations. Okay. Just for a second, does anybody know what abominations are? Not just like what we would call an abomination, but that word's used here and through Scripture. How is that word used? Is it okay things? No. Who defines what abominations are? God defines what abominations are. Okay. So if God has defined something as an abomination, and it's usually an act, right? It's something you do. He doesn't necessarily usually say, Peggy is an abomination. He says what Peggy does is an abomination, okay? So you don't even have to give a list necessarily, but do you know some things that God has called abominations? Homosexuality. What else? Heterosexual immorality, equally an abomination in God's eyes. One's just more perverse in human nature than the other. But both of them, basically anything that you want to put in the category of a stoning offense, what God said in the Old Testament should be killed. Do you know that rebellion of a child
Yes.
is an abomination? It's considered as bad as they were to be taken to the city, outside the city gates, and they were to be stoned. But what do we do with rebellion nowadays?
Put them on medication.
Yeah. Put them on medication. Blame them. What's that?
Blame the teacher.
Blame the teacher, blame the
Yeah.
parent, or we basically, in one thing we do with it is we label it normal teenage. So if it's normal, if we normalize it, it's no longer considered an abomination, right? They're all just gonna do that, right?
Right.
I say all the time, normal or natural is a better way. Another word for natural is fleshly. How does God view fleshly activities? Does he say they're okay? Rarely. It's sin. It might be big sin or little sin. And I know people say God doesn't grade sins. God has different consequences on earth for different sins. So yes, God does grade sin. Even in this chapter, what is the mother of abominations? What is she held responsible for? All those abominations, right? And God names them. Okay, so here's another question, more rhetorical. If God names something abominations, are we supposed to redefine it? Are we supposed to normalize it, as I just said?
No.
No. Are we supposed to stand against it? Okay. Are we necessarily supposed to pick up stones now and throw them at them? God's greater desire isn't that a person die for an abomination. God's greater desire is what?
Change.
That they change. Right. That we take that situation, like we might have a responsibility to take that situation in their lives and define it God's way, and that takes the responsibility off you. You're not saying, I think this is wrong. Really, you're saying God says this is wrong. And really even better, like I've said of the one prayer request we have, it's not in your best interest, right? It's not in your best interest to be living a life that's filled with immorality or abominations. It's not good for you. That's what God has defined as what's good for you, not wanting everybody to know they're wrong all the time. You know, what some people portray God of the Old Testament, as they say, as this God of wrath. Well, we're seeing a lot of wrath here. But that's the question is, should we say what God has called an abomination, he no longer sees it that way? No, we've got to be really careful about that. And it really is loving to let people understand that the lifestyle they've chosen, the path they're on, the specific action they're taking is dangerous and destructive to themselves and others around them. Does any of our life choices ever just impact ourselves?
No.
No. There's always a ripple effect. Okay, so she is called Babylon the Great. She's called the mother of harlots and of abominations. So you could also say mother of abominations, but I'm just going to say mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And then we see she's drunk with what?
Blood.
Bless you.
Thank you.
And with the blood, not just of saints, but witnesses.
Witnesses.
Bless you. Thank you.
And then there's the angel that's talking to John. Remember, the last two times, the 3 and 4 times of in the Spirit, it's one of the angels who had the 7 bowls is the one that takes John in the Spirit. So he's the one speaking to John at this point. Now, obviously, he has God's message or Jesus' message, and it says, "Why do you wonder? I shall tell you the mystery of the woman." Remember, her name, what was written on her forehead, was a mystery. So he's going to tell him, we get it, the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, just for a second, did you look back in chapter 13 to see if this description of 7 heads and 10 horns fits a previous beast that we've looked at? If you have your person pages, and you look at what you wrote about the beast originally, how was he described? He came out of the sea, he had 10 horns and 7 heads, and on the horns are 10 diadems, and on the heads are blasphemous names. Isn't that exactly what we read up here? So the probability is it's this beast, right? Because God gave us the description before on purpose, He's given us again on purpose to point us to something, point us to these mysteries that we're going. Okay, now we get into some very interesting statements. In verse 8 it says, the beast that you saw, what does it say?
It's about to come up.
Was
And is not,
and is not,
and is about to come.
is about to come.
Yes, about the abyss.
Okay, come out of the abyss
And go to destruction.
and go to destruction. And you fully understand every part of that, right?
Absolutely not.
It's clear as mud, right? Okay.
Who was, means he's alive, means he was dead, and he's about to come.
Okay.
It is the third time.
Coming out of where? Abyss. And then go to destruction. Okay, you see a huge amount of information, not just this event happens, that, it's not like, okay. So if he was, then he was alive, but if he is not,
Means he's dead.
he died. This is what we think this probably means. And then is about to come out of the abyss. What does that indicate?
Resurrection.
Like a resurrection, right? But specifically, out of the abyss. And eventually, he's going to go to destruction. Does that help a little bit? Okay, where else have we heard about a beast coming out of the abyss? Do you remember? Mentioned it earlier in reference to the,
Chapter 13.
no, before that. Well, there is something in 13, but where do we see a beast first mentioned in Revelation?
When the two witnesses.
2 witnesses, right. 2 witnesses in chapter
11.
11. When the 2 witnesses are killed, they're killed by the beast that comes out of the abyss. All right? So if the 2 witnesses happen, the end of their ministry and their death happens at the end of the 6th trumpet by the beast that comes out of the abyss, when does this part happen? Before that, right? It has to, this beast that was and is not and is about to come out of the abyss part, he has to have happened, he has to have been was. Yes. Okay, grammatically figure that sentence out. Okay, and we'll put this on the timeline in a minute, but I want you can kind of see the hints here, but of where we used to be last week. But if he is on the scene at the end of the 2 witnesses' ministry, at the end of that 1260 days, in order to kill them, and it's the beast that comes out of the abyss that does that part, then that beast had to be, and to have not been, and then comes out of the abyss to take that action. And remember, here it says, and the world wondered, right? Like they're marveling at it. What do we hear about the beast in chapter 13? Remember, in chapter...
Sea.
He came out of the sea. Yes,
He
this
had
is...
10 horns and 7 heads.
So he had that description, which is great and connecting. But remember in verse 3, 12, and 14, we focused on the fact that he had a fatal wound, which was healed. The fatal wound in verse 14, we're told, comes from a sword. And in verse 12, it says it again, that he had a fatal wound which was healed. So if you want to cross-reference something, put in your margin over there, like Revelation 13, 3, 12, and 14 are the first one, and then cross-reference it, and Revelation 11, 7. This is where you can cross-reference your own Bible, and then you go back to those places so that we can pull this stuff together. We don't want to say something that isn't said here. Can we say that the beast who has 7 heads, 10 horns, 10 crowns or diadems on those horns is the one that's talked about in Revelation 13 who had a fatal wound which was healed. Is that the was and is not part? Fatal wound that was healed? What kind of wound was it? By what? Sword. Okay, so if you were on the scene at the time and you were studying this and you saw someone who's existing back here in whatever form, I mean, I don't know what capacity, I shouldn't say form, I believe he's a human, but in whatever capacity, whatever he's doing during the time of the two witnesses' ministry, prophecy, because remember, they stop here, but they go backwards here in time. They don't go backwards in time. Their time goes backwards from that point because we know the end point. And he comes on the scene to kill them, but he's come out of the abyss already. That's what 11 tells us. He's come out of the abyss. If he's come out of the abyss, this is the part that has had to happen. He had to be, or was, and he had to, is not. He had to have been, he had to die, and then he has to come back out of the abyss. And he said that's like a resurrection. Now, if the world saw that now, certainly then, when it's going to happen, would you wonder? Would you marvel? Would you be greatly amazed? Right? And remember, that beast takes out the two witnesses that nobody could touch. So when he kills them, don't you think the world's going to go, wow, he's the man, right? And they're going to follow after him much more fully as a result of that. Okay, so you see that you have to place this beast in time back here doing something, existing, dying, resurrecting, killing the two witnesses, right? And then in chapter 13, when it says he comes out of the sea, and then it tells also this other stuff about him. One of the things it tells is, again, he existed, he has a fatal wound, it's healed, fatal wound by a sword, and it's healed. And the world wonders. Yes, Brenda?
But you know what this sounds like? Christ.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, it's not, I don't, it's like, Satan always has a,
Counterfeit.
yes.
Yes. So exactly, if we had experienced the resurrection of Christ, I mean, we have in thought and words and understanding and through the Holy Spirit, we've experienced it. But if you lived in that day and you were Thomas and he comes through a doorway and you fall on your feet, you see the resurrected Christ. In a similar way, put yourself in the place of being an earth dweller at that time who doesn't have Christianity, doesn't have the Holy Spirit, and this person that's doing whatever he's doing. We're not really sure yet what the beast is doing during the time, let's say just during the time of the two witnesses. Nobody can touch them. They seem all powerful. And then this beast who's died, and it was a person who's died and come back to life and is able to kill them, the world is going to go, we got to follow him. And it's going to bring about worship. That's what chapter 13 talks about. It's one of the things that's going to bring about worship. But yes, there's a counterfeit here. There is a dualism of this is what Jesus did. Now Satan's going to do a similar thing. Not Jesus, Satan's not the one that is the Jesus in the story. The beast is the one that's in the story, right? So you've got the dragon giving his power to this beast and giving him authority and giving him a kingdom. And then telling him, I want you to go after the saints, and I want you to overcome them. So that's going to be one of his goals. And he is going to war with the saints. Yeah, it's very powerful stuff, very compelling stuff, and understanding how people can be deceived by it, obviously. And that's one of the things the second beast does, is deceives the whole world with his signs and wonders that he does in the presence of the first beast. This is
We
powerful
haven't
stuff.
seen the word, but is this the Antichrist?
The word's not in the book of Revelation, but that's what we see in 2 Thessalonians. That's where he's called. Yeah. Is it? Let's hang on to that because it looks a lot like
Looks
it,
a
right?
lot, sounds a lot like.
Sure does. So, but just see, these words are kind of obscure until you start putting them in, like the fatal wound that was healed. is this the same beast? If it is the same beast, I mean, seriously, do you think there's a beast of 11 and a beast of 13? Not just the second beast of 13 and then another beast? That's a possibility. I mean, let's be as literal as we can. But is God giving us the clues to say it's the same one? Same description here, full of blasphemous names, you know, and all of that. Scarlet beast and the 7 heads and 10 horns and all of that. But now we're getting a little more of what does all that mean. So he was and is not, comes up out of the abyss. But this is the beautiful part. He's going to go to destruction. Right? Hang on to that. That's one of the perseverance of the saints, right?
And then it says right after that, that if they don't have the mark of the beast, they're not going to be able to buy or sell.
In chapter 13, yeah,
Uh-huh.
right. So that's part of what is surrounding him. You have the beast, you have an image that's made to him. That image can speak and call somebody out. You know, that one doesn't worship the image, and so they're going to be killed. But also, they have to get the mark of the beast, which is either his name or the number of his name, and that's the 666. And you have to get it where? On your forehead, on your right hand, one of the two. And so you're going to have some identifier, and that's going to allow you to buy and sell, right, during this time. It's not here yet. But that
And
is,
him doing all of these things that look so spectacular
Yes.
and everything.
yes,
That's,
it's going to fool a lot of people. So they're going to be fooled by the beast himself, because he's empowered with by the dragon, and people are going to worship him, but they're mainly going to start worshiping him because he is not, and is about to come out of this. That's, as Brenda said, that is a counterfeit of what Jesus did, and that's our proof. We just celebrated it on Sunday. What is the proof of Jesus? It's not the proof that Jesus was resurrected, but the fact that Jesus was resurrected. What does that prove to us? That he is alive and still alive, not going to ever die again. But what else does it prove? What does it prove in the economy of God? What did he do by dying?
He washed away all of our sins.
He took on the consequence of all of our sin, and he died. As a result, he died on purpose on our behalf. And he could have stayed dead if he also was deserving, if he had sinned. But when he was raised from the dead, what does that prove? That God was satisfied. He would not have been satisfied with anything less than perfection. And Jesus is and was. Jesus was perfection. If Jesus had died on behalf of yours and my sin because he was willing, but he had his own sin, he would have stayed dead. If I decided to jump in front of one of my children in a bullet and take the bullet, I would die to save them, but I'd stay dead. Right? I would stay dead for the punishment for that action. You know, maybe even if they were deserving of death and I took that on. But when Jesus died, his resurrection proves God was satisfied. The propitiation had been made. Because if he was worthy of death for his own sins, he would have stayed dead. So it proved his perfection. It proved he was the perfect sacrifice for us. It proved that he was without blemish, without any flaw or diminishing anything. He was without sin. That's what the resurrection proves. It's a powerful truth. Okay, so when this dragon, or when this beast, it comes back to life, the point that we've got to remember is he also will go to destruction, right? That's not true of Jesus, but it's going to look like the same thing for a while, for a short time. And people are going to be fooled by it. And they're going to follow after the beast, and they are going to worship him as a result of that. It's kind of hard to blame them to a certain extent, except that they have the opportunity to understand. And as you were pointing out with the mark of the beast and not being able to buy or sell, there's going to be some that don't take that mark, and they're going to suffer consequences for that. They're going to suffer want, or they're going to suffer hunger or death as a consequence of that. But what is the eternal consequence for taking the mark?
Forever lost.
Forever lost. And
Your name's not written in the book of life.
your name's not written in the book of life, so what's the ultimate consequence of that? Where are you gonna go? Eternal death.
And separation from God.
Forever,
Yeah.
eternally.
That's worse than hell.
Well, there is, yes.
I mean, because, to be forever, you can never get to him and never experience
Right.
what God wants us to experience, the spirit and I can't even imagine.
No, we can't, we don't really even want to, except in order to try to tell somebody about it. And yes, it is okay to tell people about hell. It's okay to tell them that ultimately, everybody in hell is going to the lake of fire. So there's even a different ultimate than what we say now. We kind of stop with hell. Well, there's a worse and more ultimate place, and that comes after, in chapter 20, at the great white throne judgment, that they all are sent into the lake of fire. Okay, so we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, so let's stay here, but that's all good, that we kind of know these things. We're trying to put our minds around them. Okay, so then it says, those who dwell on the earth will wonder, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and will come. So the fact that he lived, he died, and he came back, if that's what this means, and it looks like it does, they're going to wonder. Of course, not like wonder, I can't figure it out, but like, wow, be in awe and wonder. And be amazed, yes. And then it says, here's the one that has wisdom. Here we are. 7 heads are 7 mountains. I'll write that here. 7 heads are 7 mountains, but they're also 7 kings. And remember, the woman is sitting on them. And it says, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. But when he comes, he must remain a little while. Okay, another really clear statement, right? We can do the math. That part is pretty easy. 5, 1, and 1 more. All right? So what does this mean? Now remember, John is being told this, so it could be that he's being told it in like his perspective. If 5 kings have already happened, and 1 is that what it was? 1 is. 5 have fallen, 1 is. That 1 is could mean during John's time. But it also could mean we're looking to the future. Like there's going to be 5, they're going to fall, there's going to be 1, and another is going to come. But regardless, there's going to be 5, and then 1, and another is going to come. Okay? Whatever this happens. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. Not real clear there of the when of this. But then it says, and the beast which was and is not is himself an 8th. Okay, could he be number 7? The one that is going to come and remain a little while? Just think about this for a second. If that is telling us that he is one of the 7, but he's also an 8th, could that be one of the 7 and then here he is the 8th by coming back to life? My pen's down on me. Maybe. It's tough to figure some of this out, for sure. But he is part, I mean, these are his heads. So this beast has these 7 heads, and these 7 heads are 7 kings, and he's one of those 7, but he's also an 8th. And don't forget, it says again, he goes to destruction. We always want to hang on to that statement, for sure. Okay. And the 10 horns are also what? So these are 7. Okay, 7. Yeah, I gotta get a better marker. Markers are going out on me. Screen. Okay. So 7 heads are 7 kings.
10 horns or 10 kings.
And this is 7 mountains, right? And then you've got 10 horns are also
10 kings.
10 kings. Okay. Now, we spend some time on these 10 kings. What do we know about them?
They
They've
have
not
not received
received
a kingdom.
They haven't yet received a kingdom, but they do receive what?
Authority.
Authority as kings for how long?
1
1 hour. So that indicates either literally 1 60-minute period or a very short time. So basically, they're given authority as kings, but not yet receive a kingdom. Okay? And what is the purpose of them getting this authority?
They give power and authority to the beast.
Okay, so just imagine 10 kings that have no kingdom, but they have some power. They're given that authority, and they give that authority have it for 1 hour, because what's their goal? Is to give all that to the beast. So basically, they're empowered to empower him. Okay, you can imagine some sort of coalition. You can imagine some sort of groupings of countries, let's say. What's that? NATO, it would be one. United Nations might be another. The European Union, this is why a lot of people were really looking at the European Union, because they kept counting how many are in it, how many are in it. This is part of why is, and it doesn't mean that it is. I'm not sitting here saying that I know the European Union are these 10 horns, but let's say that the European Union was forming and suddenly it does fit, let's say, that was happening, and there's 10 of them. And the 10 of them have their realms, have their authority, but that authority is then given to the beast. All of a sudden, he's put in a position over them, and they give him all their power.
So he's even more powerful.
Yes, because now he's got the whole of their 10 king sort of ships. The authority that they're given. Okay? And what will this group of 10 horns kings do? What does it say in 4? They're going to wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them because he is Lord of Lords and Kings of Kings. And those who are with him are called, the chosen, and the faithful. Now this is something that we will see happen in another chapter, but it's told here that it's this 10 kings, this 10 horns of the beast that are going to make that war against the Lamb that we're going to see in chapter 19. Okay, and then it said, the waters, because remember this angel is telling us the mystery. The waters are what? The woman is sitting on. These waters are what?
People's multitudes, tongues, and nations.
Peoples, multitudes,
And nations and tongues.
tongues,
With hearts.
and nations. Okay. So that makes you think about what about this woman? If there's if these waters are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues that she is sitting on. So if she's sitting on them, what does that kind of indicate?
Ruling on.
She's over them, ruling over them, has some sort of authority from them or whatever. And so what is the scope of her reach? Yeah, or worldwide, or a lot at least, yeah. Whether it's literally everywhere on the earth, but it's going to be a lot. And then the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast. So these 10 horns, of course they're of the beast, but the 10 horns, which are 10 kings, that give their power to the beast, they will do what? Towards the harlot, what are they going to do?
Destroy.
Okay, so the 10 kings and the beast destroy her, right?
Mhm.
How do they do it specifically? Yeah, it's really bad. Make her desolate, make her naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Remember that part especially. They burn her with fire. And the reason for this is why? Who is responsible for it? God. God has put this purpose in their hearts to execute his purpose. By having a common purpose, they give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. God is using this group of people to bring about what he wants brought about. It's not usually the way we like to view God, is it? And then in verse 18, what does it say about the woman?
She is a
She's a great city.
city which reigns over the kings of the earth.
Okay. She's a great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. So again, like the other statement I asked, what is the scope of her reach? Worldwide.
Yeah.
Right. Pretty big. And then in chapter 18, we see the fall of Babylon the Great. How does it come about? What are some of the things that show you what's happening. Number one, people watch, right? What are they watching? The fall, but what do they see? I want you to stand and watch with them. What do they see?
The city, the great city.
They see a great city, and what's happening?
It's on fire.
It's on fire. It's burning. Remember it said up there, they're gonna make her desolate, naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. So this is, and then it tells us this is a city. So we're not talking about watching a woman catch on fire, even though she's being described as a woman, but this is a city. In verse 8, in chapter 18, the whole thing is about people standing at a distance and watching a city burn, right? Okay, so what is Babylon? A city, right. When we see a lot of imagery in 17 that's giving us the mystery of who Babylon is and the description of who Babylon is, now we see the literal in 18. And the very end, verse 18 of 17, is that she is a great city. Babylon is a great city. Okay? Can Babylon, the great city, be Babylon that we know is Babylon? It's on a point on a map. There is a town, there is a city named Babylon, right? Can it be that Babylon? Yeah, pretty simple. It can be. Many people want to take this and say, oh, it's America, for instance. A lot of people have done that. I mean, and we can see ourselves in there, right? The description. But Babylon goes all the way back to Genesis. Babylon is originally called Babel. Yeah, the Tower of Babel. It's in a location, if you do my horrible maps, of the Tigris and the Euphrates coming together, way over to the east of Israel, with the Mediterranean Sea over here, and Israel hugging it over here, and then you've got a desert here. You've got the Tigris and the Euphrates, and you've got the Persian Gulf down here. Okay, I'm giving you the gift of imagination. So next to, on the west side of the Tigris, no, west side of the Euphrates, is a point on the map called Babylon. And in recent years, in our lifetime, we've seen that city being rebuilt. By who? Somebody who's dead now. Saddam Hussein. He even made coins with his profile on them that was exactly like the profile of Nebuchadnezzar that you read about in the book of Daniel. Real person that happened who made the city of Babylon very great in its day. Babylon was an empire that affected Israel back in Daniel's story. But we also have Babylon now, or being talked about here in Revelation. Can it be that same place? Yeah, it can be. I'm not going to die on that hill, but it can be. So the easiest thing to assume is it is. Okay? Doesn't have to be, but I'm just saying. It's the easiest thing. So just hang on to that. Again, we'll see. But it is a city, right? If you take the idea of and the knowledge of in chapter 18 that this is a city that groups of people, what are some of the groups of people that are watching her burn?
Nations.
Nations, merchants, nations of the earth.
Kings.
Right, kings, people are standing off, they're weeping. Why are they weeping? Right, they got wealthy by her. They're not real happy that that's going to burn up, literally. That source is going to burn up. But they're standing from a distance, weeping. They're not rushing in to help, right? There's also a strange statement in verse 4 that says, a voice from heaven says, come out of her, my people, that you may not participate in her sins, and that you may not receive of her plagues. Can people come out of something that is a figurative nothing? Or do they come out of a place? They come out of the city. That city, what we see in chapter 17 described as this harlot, this woman, is how God views the city for sure. But how do we know that 18 is the same description as we see in 17? What are some of the similarities of what we see in 18 as she's being described? What happened within her that we see over here as well?
Drunk with the wine of the passion of her immorality.
Yes, so you've got, she's drunk with the wine of the passion of her immorality. Nations committed immorality with her. Kings participated in immorality with her. These merchants got their trade from her. That's part of, it seems, their participation in her immorality. Okay? Then, so the same things are said of what the kings do with this city, what the people of earth do with this city, talking about her immorality and her sensuality, and that she's drunk on the wine of the passion of her immorality. Those things very much harken back to what we saw here in the description of the woman and the harlot. We don't want to just rush forward and say this is what this says. We want to see that it says it's the same thing. What is being described in 17 as a mystery, we're now seeing being destroyed in 18 and how it's being destroyed. It's a real city. It had merchants, trade going on. What else was going on there that makes it understandable as a city?
People were coming by ship to visit.
Okay, people were coming to a literal location by ship to visit before it burned, and then they see that from a distance. What else that ties it together and lets us know not only is it a city, but it is what is being described in 17? Anything else? Number one, it says the great city, the great city, the great city, the great city. So you got to know that it's a city. But in verse 16, it tells us, it says, woe, woe, the great city. She was clothed in linen and purple and scarlet, and she's adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. Okay, this is the same harlot of 17. But that's just that God sees this city system as a harlot and the immorality that was going on. But if you were clothed in purple and scarlet and gold and precious stones and pearls, if a person was, and certainly a city is described here, what would you say of that? What does purple and scarlet represent?
Royalty.
Royalty, wealth. The purple especially was a very difficult dye to get, so really only the rich or royalty usually had that. And then scarlet, and then you've got adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. What does that indicate? If I was dripping
Money.
it represents wealth, money. And for a city, it represents maybe the trade of those things, but certainly still represents a very wealthy city, one that has gotten extremely rich, and people have gotten, and it says in verse 17, for in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. Right? Who's bringing this about? God, and he's using the 10 kings and the beast to do it, but it's God's purpose, right? What does this tell you about God and the overall scheme of things? If you've got a city that has gotten this much wealth, is this powerful because of that? Because remember, she is reigning over the kings of the earth, and she's sitting on these peoples and nations and tongues. Have we ever seen a city, one city, that has had that scope of power? We've had some that are pretty close. I mean, England was pretty strong before we revolted, right? America has ruled the world to some extent, not really ruled it, but we have been wealthier than anyone else, and we're on the teetering edge and about to fall.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to bring about our own demise to some extent, but certainly the people that we've helped throughout the ages as a nation are going to turn on us, and they're going to do it with glee. But there's not been one city or one kingdom or one particular power that has had the type of reign that this is seeming to describe over the entire world, right? And the way she got there was riding on the beast. He's carrying her there, but then he's going to turn on her and he's going to destroy her, along with these 10 kings. The beast got his earthly power, looks like, from these 10 kings. So there's a lot of manipulating and maneuvering going on here. But we want to see that this is a city, definitely a city. We see that in chapter 17, but we also see it very clearly in 18. It just says, a great city, the great city, the great city. Remember, if God repeats something, he wants us to understand that's what he means. And literally, we can understand it. People are standing off because their wealth is going down the tubes with that wealth. They're at least cutting off of it. They may retain some of theirs, but their source is being cut off. And it's going away. We see that she is extremely wealthy. But we also see at the end of this chapter the kinds of things, normal things, that were going on within her, right? What kind of people are described that are no longer going to be? Verse 22. No craftsman, no sound of a mill, no light of a lamp, no voice of a bride and a bridegroom, no merchants, right? So normal things were happening in this city. Normal life was happening in this city. Like normal life is going on here right now. But if we were laid waste, those things would no longer be. Or we're not a city, we're a nation, but in this case, in this city. But those things are not going to happen anymore. This is literally, remember, the 10 kings and the beast are going to make her desolate. We're not just talking about a localized fire that does some damage and they're going to rise from the ashes. We're talking about God laying her waste, just completely destroying her, laying it out. There was sorcery because the nations were deceived by her sorcery, but in her, in verse 24, was found what?
Blood.
Right, remember she was drunk with the blood of the saints and the witnesses of Jesus. Here it says, in her, basically she is being held responsible for blood of prophets, saints, and all who have been slain on the earth. God lays that at her door. Pretty amazing when you think about it. Okay, so what can we know about Babylon? Babylon is what?
A great city.
A great city. Number one, you guys start there. And as a great city who sits on many waters, she has the impact and influence over peoples, nations, and tongues. So what is this a normal city in that sense? No. So what kind of scope of her realm is it? We've already said this. Worldwide. So this is not just a city. But within a city you have commerce, you have government, right? You're going to have a city system. But this city is not just going to confine itself to its boundaries, it's going to rule worldwide. So this is not just a city, a place on a map. This is a city that has government. So when you were answering those questions on day 5, what else would be involved, and not just what else would normally be involved in a city, but what else do we see here? Her influence and all. Is it a religious system? Is it a governmental system? Is it just a commerce system? What else might it be?
All of the above.
All of the above? I agree. I think it's got to be all. It's their immorality that's involved. When we think of immorality, we tend to think of it one way. We think of it as sexual immorality. God uses the picture of sexual immorality to point to what? To help us to understand what?
Other kinds of immorality.
Right, like what? Other kinds of immorality, I agree, but like how God gives us the picture of...
Like overcoming other cities to get what you want out of them.
Okay, so being unethical.
Being unethical.
Right, or greedy, obviously, yeah. So now we're outside the realm of just sexual immorality. Now we're into morality or ethics. I agree. What else would God gives us a picture of? Earthly relationships, a husband and wife relationship. If I go and commit adultery, that falls under the realm of sexual immorality, right? Because only within my marriage, husband and wife marriage, is sexuality okay in God's definition, right? So anything outside of that, which can include premarital sex, as we would call it, that's a different kind. That's usually called fornication. Adultery is involving married people usually. That's usually how we define the differences, but there's still sexual immorality outside a husband-wife relationship, right? And then there's heterosexual immorality, which is another form of sexual immorality. There's bestiality, there's child molestation. I mean, anything that is really the easiest way to describe it is, like I've already said, the only time sex is right in the eyes of God is between a husband and a wife. And it's not the third wife and the sixth wife and the 10th wife. It's a husband and wife. Okay? And obviously it's not more than one at a time. Bigamy or polygamy. He's talking about one man, one woman. That's the only. Anything else sexual is sexual immorality. That's the reason pornography is sexual immorality. People want to let us get by with that one. Even though it's hurtful and destructive, it's still defined as immorality, sexual immorality. Okay, so it's really a narrow definition of what's okay, and then everything else falls outside that realm. But God uses that picture to show us a different type of adultery, and that is a spiritual adultery. What is the spiritual adultery? Idol worship. Any worship, again, let's narrowly define, easily define the one okay type of spiritual relationship, and that's between God and me, or a person, between God and a person, right? That's the only okay one, okay? So God uses the picture of, because all I have to do is ask any of you, if your spouse cheated on you, how would you feel? And some of you might be able to answer, other people might be able to answer that really quite literally, but it wouldn't be hard for us to empathize even if we never dealt with that. But that's a break in our relationship, right? And God uses that picture to say, how do you think it makes me feel when you break a relationship with me? That's spiritual idolatry, is spiritual adultery, is what God calls it. Okay? So when he's talking about the immorality within the city, and that the kings of the earth committed immorality with her, well, a literal man king can't have sex with a city. Right? But he can do unethical, immoral, greedy commerce or politics. We know how unethical that usually is, right? But also, could he not be committing idolatry with a religious system? Right? And remember, she's writing on the beast, and what's associated with the beast? Worship. There's going to be beast worship and dragon worship as a result. In chapter 13 we saw that. So some of the immorality described here, I think, you hear the I think part? I think possibly is describing idolatry as well. As sexual immorality, I think, always follows in that as well. I think there's a lot of that going on here too. And then obviously people being killed, because she's held responsible for the deaths of all these people, and certainly the deaths of the saints and the witnesses of Jesus. So we've got maybe a military involved that would go out and carry out these deaths, and a system has to be in place of things you violate. So you are breaking the law, and they're going to take action against you. I mean, you see how this is not just a city. It's not just a woman. It's not just a city, even though it is a city. It's a city with worldwide impact, pretty much in every realm that Kay asks about here. Whether it is a religious system, a political system, a literal city, or any combination. All of the above. Right? And her relationship with the kings of the earth is that relationship of she rides on them, she reigns over the nations, but then they ultimately do what to her? They destroy her, right? And the relationship to the nations we talked about, she reigns over the kings of the earth, and she's sitting on the sea, which is the waters, which are the nations included, and then all the blood of the prophets and the saints and those that testify for Jesus are in her. Okay, so now that we have an idea of who she is, let's see if we can kind of figure out when this is. And we're going to think about, we're not going to put everything that we had on our chart last week. We're going to kind of abbreviate it a little bit this week because we just want to get some major highlights. And we've talked about some of this, so it should be able to come back together well, and I'm sorry for the green pen, because it's harder to read. But if we draw our timeline up here, and we have the seals, and there's 7 of us. 7, and then out of the 7th one comes the trumpets. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Out of the trumpets come the bowls. 6, 7. Okay, last week, now each, if you can get your, get your chart out even from last week and you just want to add a little bit to it. What we determined was the end of the 1260 days of the 2 witnesses ended when? At the end of the 6th trumpet. So this is this is number 6, that's number 7. So at the end of the 6th trumpet, we have time going this way at 1260 days of the 2 witnesses. 1260 days of the 2 witnesses. Okay? We have an arrow because we don't know, we're not going to go back and say we know it starts at the first seal necessarily. We just know it ends here. We're going to stick with what we know. Okay? But at the end of the 2 witnesses, who brings this about and is on the scene? We've got the beast coming out of the abyss, right? That's who brings that event about at that point in time. So he has to be on the scene back here somewhere. That's all we know right now. The beast is back here somewhere, already doing stuff, already living at least. But back here, somewhere, you've got the beast was, is not, and is about to come out of the abyss, right? Because he has come out of the abyss at this point. So all of this is back somewhere in this time. What else we can know is that this beast who comes out of the abyss had come out of the sea. Whatever that means. But he came out of the sea. Now when she's sitting on many waters, those many waters are described as people, nations, tongues, and multitudes. If that's the same thing, don't know that, but water seems to a lot of times represent that. Again, figurative when it needs to be. Or it tells us the mystery in 17 of the woman riding on the beast. Okay? So you've got the beast who was, but he has to be is not. I hate the grammar of this. And he has to then be about to come out of the abyss, and then he has come out of the abyss at this point. Okay, so from what else can we know? In chapter 12, we've got the dragon being described, and the dragon has a point in time where there is a war in heaven. As a reaction or as an outcome of that war in heaven, he is thrown to the earth, and he only has a short time, and he's enraged. And he goes after the woman of chapter 12, not the woman of chapter 17. He goes after the woman of 12, which we believe is Israel, the picture of Israel. And she is nourished for 1260 days, times and half a time. Okay? So if that happens after the sixth trumpet, and she goes forward from this point 1260 days, and that's the woman, and then the dragon is enraged, and he goes after the woman, and then he goes after the rest of her offspring. At what point do you think the war in heaven happened and he's cast to earth? Yeah, so if you have a war in heaven, and we want to put it up here, and the result is the devil is cast down to earth, or the dragon, sorry. Well, he is the devil. The dragon and his angels are cast down to earth, and then from that point forward, he goes after, the woman is nourished and protected from him for 1260 days. That's the period of time he's operating. That's the short time he has, possibly, right? And as a result of being cast to the ground, who does he empower? The dragon empowers
The beast.
The beast. Okay, so this would be the time that he is empowered by the dragon, would be from that point forward. But he's on the scene. He was, is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss. He does come up out of the abyss. So the chapter 13 verses 3, 12, and 14 statements of the fatal wound that was healed, and the chapter 17 statement in verse 8 of was and is and not is about to come up. That fatal wound had to happen back here. He had to be healed from it, and which means he's brought back to life before the point of the two witnesses ending. So those events have to happen back there sometime. How long they take, we don't know. But they happen during that time prior to the two witnesses stopping. Then you've got a change. You've got the dragon being enraged, and he empowers this beast that's already in existence. The beast that is in existence again, in essence, that has the second beast, who is his sidekick. Whether the second beast is during this time, whether the image is during this time, whether the mark of the beast is during this time, we're not real sure, but we do know it's over here. It's in place, at least, over here. Because it's from this time forward that you start hearing about if they take the mark of the beast. So they're buying and selling. So when does the mark of the beast actually come on the scene? We don't really exactly know on this timeline yet, but we know it's in place over here during the time of the beast actually giving the authority. Something shifts in the beast. Not in, yeah, there's a lot that shifts in the beast, but something shifts in his like over, he's existing over here, he's in power over here. Stuff's going on. Pretty amazing. And then we see the going through the 7 bowls, and in the 7th bowl you've got the fall of Babylon. Talked about. God remembers her at this point. All of the bowls are poured out. It is done. It is finished. The wrath of God is in these bowls. And when the last one is it is done. Which you could put that below or above. But it is done in that point. And then we start hearing about who is Babylon. Let me explain her to you. And what happens, literally happens in the fall of Babylon is the destruction. Okay, so the fall of Babylon happens here at that. Now, why am I so certain of that? Not in chapter 17 or 18 do I know how I can nail that down, except that the bowls have been poured out and it's mentioned, but chapter 19 comes. Yes. As a result of the fall of Babylon, therefore after the fall of Babylon, then we have what event? Jesus returning, right? And we'll get into that next week. I don't want to preempt too much, but that's how we can absolutely know it happens here, because what happens next, which is meaning our timeline's not done yet, what happens next is the coming of Christ, because it is finished. The wrath of God is finished. All of this part is done. He's brought it about. The fall of Babylon is the final achievement. I was going to say the crowning glory, and that might be true, but the final achievement, the final part of all of this happening and culminating in this action. And then we've got Christ returning. But always remember, in Christ's return, there's a war that's going to be waged that was talked about back here in chapter 17. Who is going against Jesus in chapter 19? Who's going against him? They're identified in 17. Beast and these 10 kings. The beast and the 10 kings specifically.
We're gonna be there.
we get a great seat for this. That is absolutely true. We're going to be there. But also, if you back up a little bit, in the 7th bowl being poured out, or the 6th bowl being poured out, you see the demons that have that look like unclean spirits that are like frogs coming out of the mouth of the prophet. The false prophet. I'll go backwards. Mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Sometimes we call that the unholy trinity. Remember the counterfeiting of God's ways? Okay, so you've got the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Who do you think the false prophet is? Because it's not mentioned this way before. You've got the dragon. You've got the beast. Who's the false prophet that we've seen him before? Who do you think it is? Chapter 13, what else do we see in chapter 13? First beast and the second beast, because what does the second beast do? He turns everybody towards the first beast. So here he's called the false prophet. Yep. And what do they do? What do these spirits of demons that come out of the mouths of those three do? They perform signs and go to the kings of the whole world and gather them for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Fast forward to chapter 17. The 10 kings and the beast are going to wage war against the Lamb. Chapter 19 is that war. Remember, things are mentioned sometimes. Gathering starts happening, but the war doesn't happen until later. But they're linked, and hopefully you can link them. So we've begun to put some things on our timeline. I wanted to make sure that we saw where the fall of Babylon is, what we discussed today, and we can, is there any, I mean, sometimes y'all are looking at me and I think you're more confused than cleared up. I get excited when we can nail something down, but I think y'all are going, I'm not sure about that. So do you have a question? And basically put it in pencil. If you find out I'm wrong, erase it. Right? When these events happen, it's going to be very obvious as they're happening. Just like past prophecy, when God gave a prophecy, like in the Old Testament, about even the fall of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. They had all the information, but they couldn't really understand it until it was happening. And then it is exactly what God said it was going to be in ways that are eerie. Another is in Psalms, David, I forgot which one it is. I want to say 71, but I don't think that's it. But where David, in the beginning of the psalm, because he is the one that wrote it, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you read through that psalm, and it perfectly describes Jesus' experience of the cross. Not just on the cross, but even the dividing of his garments and all of that, no bones broken. All of that is perfectly described in a time when crucifixion had yet to be invented. And David could not have imagined the whole process of what goes on with a person that's being crucified apart from the Holy Spirit inspiring him to write that psalm. David wasn't writing it about himself. He was writing it in first person, but he wasn't writing it about himself. It's a prophecy. And now, people, especially medical people, that can tell you what would have happened to a body and what a body went through during the cross. And also we know the accounts in the Gospels of what Jesus experienced, and we know, what did Jesus say on the cross? My God, Eli, sabachthani, or whatever, I don't know the Hebrew, but some people do. But he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He wasn't quoting scripture. I've had people tell me that. He wasn't quoting scripture when he said that. Jesus could do that extremely well since he's the one that wrote it in the first place. David prophesied the event. And in that time, God the Son is saying, my God the Father, my God the Holy Spirit, why are you forsaking me? And we understand that as the turning away for just a moment. That's the passion of Christ, which we use that word, and what it really means is the agony of the Christ. The agony of Jesus on the cross was painful. It was horrible. It's a medical, if you've ever had it described medically, it is the word excruciating comes out of the cross, because there's no way to describe it except for to make up its own word. That's how bad it was. Yes, it was painful. Yes, all the stuff before it would have killed almost anyone. The crown of thorns. It's not just a nice little crown that has little pokey things on it. They shoved it down into his head. Long, spiky thorns. They ripped his back open, probably ripped his guts out from the front side with the flogging, because it would just rip away. And they did it how many strokes? That should have killed him. He was depleted of blood and everything else as he's trying to carry this cross. The falling down isn't because he was weak. It just showed he was fully human when this was happening. And somebody else came along that wasn't ripped up and carried the crossbar for him to the cross. Going through the points in the wrist and the hands, that is a nerve center. That would just shot nerve pain throughout his body. And then he hung on that and then your diaphragm can't function. And so you're having to lift yourself up on those feet that have been nailed in order to take a breath. So there's very few words said on the cross because there's very few opportunities or abilities as fully human and fully God, but fully human abilities to breathe enough. He went through all of that, and it was horrible, but the horribleness of it was carrying the entire weight of sin for every sin ever committed and to be committed on a pure, holy God that couldn't and wouldn't commit that sin. And God the Father and God the Holy Spirit, for a moment, breaking, just for a moment. He was forsaken so that we will never be forsaken. Remember, we're promised that. He will never forsake us. That's just incredible. But here, it is done. It is done. There's a done coming that is just amazing. And there's a done coming after that one. Don't you love my grammar today? It's amazing. It's coming to completion. It's coming to fulfillment. And just remember that even as we get through the next 2 lessons and finish this book in this form and in this part, we haven't touched it all. Parts 3 and 4, we're going to fill in all this stuff from other parts of Scripture. You're going to understand, I think, in ways that, and we're still going to walk away going, not really sure about that part. We don't get everything answered. And you know, what and when and where, understand. We could draw a line back here. I could draw a line and I could put it right here on the seal and I could stop it right there and tell you that I'm absolutely certain that this first seal is broken at 1260 days. I don't know that. I do know it ends here, and I do know there's 1260 days. They're going in that direction. I do know there's 1260 days the woman is nourished and protected from the dragon, who is thrown to earth at a point and goes off enraged and empowers the beast. And then the beast does more that we see, the mark of the beast and all that. Now, to answer your question, Donna, you asked about on her forehead. It doesn't say that on her forehead is 666.
No, it doesn't.
Right,
No.
and that's what I wanted you to see. What does it say? It made sense that you would think that. Not saying that she doesn't carry something, but she's a city. It doesn't say that she carries the mark of the beast, or that she literally took on the mark of the beast like a person would. Okay? So I was hoping that that question would sort of be answered within what we were saying. Remember, we stick to what we know. We try not to put more on it. It's very scary for me sometimes to even start trying to draw some of these conclusions. And that's the reason I say, you know, before God, I try to get Him to guide me. If I'm wrong, I'm okay with God correcting me. I'm okay with erasing it or whiting it out. So put it in pencil, and if we're not right, and we're going to be going over this in parts 3 and 4 over and over and over to where you have a phenomenal timeline for yourself, that it's going to be worth so much. I mean, to me it is. It's going to be worth so much that you can put those things on there for yourself and dig it out for yourself. But after this, in 3 and 4, we go outside of Revelation. Remember, still just now sticking in Revelation with no commentary for now. But we'll stop and we'll go get our food, we'll watch the video.